A farmer found 3 infants on his land. What happened next shocked everyone. Part 1. The morning sun peeked over the hills as George Wilson walked through his wheat fields. At 68, he had worked this land for over 40 years. Every day began the same, a cup of tea at dawn followed by a check of his crops. This September morning felt different. The air was cooler, and a light mist hung over the eastern field. George pulled his worn jacket tighter as he walked toward the old oak tree that marked the boundary of his property. His old dog Patch trotted ahead, suddenly stopping and barking at something near the tree. George quickened his pace, his boots crunching on fallen leaves. "What is it, boy?" he called, but Patch only barked more urgently. As George reached the tree, he heard something that made him freeze. A soft whimper, then another. Not the sound of an animal, but the unmistakable cry of a baby. There, nestled between the roots of the ancient oak, was a large wicker basket. George bent down slowly, his knees protesting. He pulled back the blanket covering the basket and gasped. 3 tiny babies looked up at him with wide eyes. 2 boys and a girl, all with tufts of dark hair and rosy cheeks. They couldn't be more than a few days old. "Good heavens," George whispered, his weathered hand trembling as he touched a tiny fist that immediately grabbed his finger. He looked around, searching for any sign of who might have left them. The field stretched empty, in all directions. Only his farmhouse stood in the distance, smoke curling from the chimney where his housekeeper Betty would be making breakfast. George had lived alone since his wife Helen died 15 years ago. Their only son James had moved to the city and rarely visited. The farmhouse that once rang with laughter had grown quiet over the years. "I can't leave you here," he told the babies, who now stared at him as if they understood. The smallest one began to cry, a sound that stirred something deep in George's chest. With careful movements, he lifted the heavy basket. His back ached, but he held the precious cargo steady as he walked home. Betty nearly dropped the teapot when George entered the kitchen with the basket. "Lord have mercy! Where did they come from?" she exclaimed, rushing to look at the babies. "Found them under the oak tree," George said, setting the basket on the kitchen table. "No note, nothing." Betty, a kind woman in her 60s, immediately began fussing over the infants. "Poor little mites. They need feeding and warmth." "I'll call Dr. Harold," George said, reaching for the telephone. His hands shook as he dialed. Within an hour, the quiet farmhouse became a flurry of activity. Dr. Harold arrived with his bag, followed by Officer Tom from the village police station. The babies were examined, fed with formula the doctor had, brought and wrapped in clean blankets. "Healthy little ones," Dr. Harold announced. "But who would leave 3 newborns in a field?" Officer Tom shook his head. "I'll need to report this. Social services will have to be notified." George, who had been watching the smallest boy sleep in Betty's arms, felt a strange tightness in his chest. What will happen to them? Foster care, most likely. Then adoption if they're lucky, Officer Tom replied. As the day wore on, neighbors from the village arrived, bringing baby clothes, bottles, and an old crib that Mr. Baker's grandchildren had outgrown. When Officer Tom prepared to leave with the babies, George found himself stepping forward. "Wait," he said, surprising himself. "Could they stay here? Just for tonight?" Officer Tom hesitated. "It's not really procedure, Mr. Wilson." "Please," George said. "Betty and I can manage just until you sort things out tomorrow." Perhaps it was the respect everyone had for George, or the way Betty nodded firmly beside him. Whatever the reason, Officer Tom agreed. That night, for the first time in years, George's farmhouse was full of life. The babies slept in a makeshift nursery in the sitting room. George sat watching them breathe, something stirring in his heart that he hadn't felt since Helen died. "What are you thinking, George Wilson?" Betty asked softly, bringing him a cup of tea. George looked up, a strange certainty in his eyes. "I'm thinking these little ones might be exactly what this old farm needs." Part 2. The next morning, George, woke to unfamiliar sounds. For a moment he lay confused in his bed before remembering the babies. He hurried downstairs to find Betty already there, feeding the smallest boy. "Good morning," she said. "These little ones have been up since dawn." George watched in wonder as the tiny infant drank hungrily from the bottle. The other two babies lay awake in their makeshift beds, tiny fists waving in the air. "Officer Tom called," Betty said quietly. "He's coming at 10 with someone from social services." George nodded, a strange heaviness settling in his chest. He had known this would happen, but somehow in the night these 3 abandoned children had worked their way into his heart. "We should name them," he said suddenly. "Just for now. We can't keep calling them the babies." Betty smiled. "I was thinking the same. What about Jack and Harry for the boys, and little Emma for the girl?" "Perfect," George agreed, picking up Emma, who had started to fuss. She settled immediately in his arms, looking up at him with trusting eyes. At precisely 10 o'clock, a car pulled up outside. Officer Tom stepped out, followed by a stern-looking woman in a gray suit. "This is Mrs. Bell from Social Services," Officer Tom introduced her. "She's here about the infants." Mrs. Bell was all business as she examined the babies and their temporary setup. "You've done well for an emergency situation," she admitted, "but we need to move them to proper facilities today." George felt his throat tighten. "What will happen to them?" "They'll be placed in emergency foster care while we search for their parents," Mrs. Bell explained. "If no one comes forward, they'll enter the adoption system." "Will they stay together?" Betty asked, cradling Harry protectively. Mrs. Bell's pause told them everything. "It's difficult to place 3 infants together. Most likely they'll be separated." George stepped forward. "What if I kept them? Just until their parents are found?" Mrs. Bell looked at him with surprise. "Mr. Wilson, that's not how the system works. You're not a registered foster carer." "But I could be," George said, the idea taking shape as he spoke. "I have plenty of room, financial stability. Betty helps me around the house and she raised 5 children of her own." "George," Betty whispered, but her eyes were shining. Mrs. Bell frowned. "Mr. Wilson, you're, forgive me, 68 years old. Taking care of 3 newborns is incredibly demanding." "I may be old, but I'm strong," George replied. "And I'm not alone. Our village takes care of its own." As if on cue, there was a knock at the door. Jane from the bakery stood there with 3 sets of baby clothes. Behind her was Fred, the retired teacher, with a box of diapers, and Dr. Harold's wife, with more formula. "Word's gotten around," Jane explained. "We wanted to help." Mrs. Bell watched as more villagers arrived, each bringing something useful for the babies. The farmhouse filled with people cooing over Jack, Harry, and Emma, offering advice and support to George. "This is unusual," Mrs. Bell admitted. "But I suppose we could consider a temporary arrangement while we process emergency foster approval. You would need inspections, background checks." "Whatever it takes," George said firmly. That evening, after everyone had left and the babies were sleeping, George sat on his porch. The stars were bright above his farm, and for the first time in years his heart felt full. "What are we getting ourselves into, George Wilson?" Betty asked, sitting beside him. "I don't know," he admitted. "But it feels right, doesn't it?" Betty nodded. "Helen would be proud of you." George smiled at the mention of his late wife. She always wanted grandchildren. Inside, one of the babies, Emma, began to cry. George stood up, surprised by how quickly his old legs carried him to her side. "It's all right," he whispered, lifting her carefully. "I'm here now." As Emma settled against his chest, George made a silent promise. Whatever happened, whether for days or weeks or longer, he would give these children all the love he had left to give. Part 3. The weeks that followed tested George in ways he never expected. His routine of 40 years vanished overnight, replaced by a schedule dictated by 3 tiny humans who needed constant attention. The village kept its promise to help. Betty moved into the spare bedroom, saying it was just until things settled. Mrs. Parker from the village school arranged a rotation of helpers, retired teachers, young mothers, and even teenagers earning pocket money. They came in shifts to feed babies, change nappies, and give George and Betty much-needed breaks. 1 month turned into 2. The investigation into the baby's parents yielded nothing. No one had reported 3 missing infants, and despite notices in newspapers and on television, no one came forward to claim Jack, Harry, and Emma. Mrs. Bell visited weekly, her initial doubts slowly giving way to reluctant approval. "You've surprised me, Mr. Wilson," she admitted during her 6th visit. "The children are thriving." It was true. Jack was the biggest, already trying to roll over. Harry watched everything with curious eyes. Emma had the strongest grip and the loudest cry when she wanted attention. On a cold November morning, Mrs. Bell arrived with a serious expression and a folder of papers. George's heart sank. Was this the end of their arrangement? "We've exhausted all avenues to find the birth parents," Mrs. Bell explained as they sat at the kitchen table. "It's time to discuss permanent placement." George took a deep breath. "I want to adopt them." Mrs. Bell wasn't surprised. "I thought you might say that. But Mr. Wilson, adopting 3 children at your age, the courts will have concerns." "I'm aware," George said. "But splitting them up would be wrong. They're a family." "And you've become their family too," Betty added, bouncing Harry on her knee. Mrs. Bell opened her folder. "The process won't be easy. There will be more inspections, interviews, financial assessments, and frankly, your age will be a significant factor." "Then I'll need to prove I'm up to it," George said firmly. The next day, George called his son, James. They hadn't spoken in months, their relationship strained by old disagreements and the distance James had put between himself and the farm. "Dad, is everything all right?" James sounded concerned. His father rarely called. "I need to see you," George said. "Something important has happened." 2 days later, James arrived from the city. He stood in shock at the farmhouse door, staring at the 3 babies playing on a blanket in what had once been his mother's sitting room. "You've lost your mind," were his first words to his father. George invited his son to sit. He explained everything, finding the babies, the village's support, and his decision to adopt them. "You're 68, Dad," James said. "What happens when you can't keep up, or worse?" George had thought about this every day. "That's partly why I asked you here." "No," James shook his head immediately. "I can't take them. My life is in the city. My career." "I'm not asking you to take them," George interrupted. "I'm asking you to be part of their lives, to be their brother, not their guardian." James fell silent. He watched as Emma crawled toward him, her small face curious. "Pick her up," George encouraged. Hesitantly, James lifted the baby girl. She stared at him with eyes that somehow reminded him of his mother's. "They need family beyond me," George said softly. "They need connections that will last." James stayed the weekend. By Sunday, Harry was falling asleep on his shoulder, and Jack was crawling after him everywhere. When it was time to leave, James paused at the door. "I'll come next weekend," he said finally. "And I'll speak to the adoption people if they want to talk to me." George nodded, knowing this small promise meant everything. That night, as the babies slept and the house grew quiet, George sat on the porch like he used to do with Helen. The farm felt alive again in a way it hadn't for years. "I think we're going to be all right," he told the stars, imagining Helen was listening somewhere. "Our family just got a bit bigger than we planned." Part 4. The adoption hearing was set for spring. For 6 months, George had to prove he could be a father to 3 growing babies. Mrs. Bell visited regularly, checking everything from the safety of the stairs to George's health reports from Dr. Harold. "Your blood pressure is excellent and your heart is strong," Dr. Harold told George during his checkup. "But raising 3 children will be hard work." "Harder than farming 60 acres for 40 years?" George asked with a smile. The babies grew quickly. Jack took his first steps just before Christmas, holding onto the coffee table and then launching himself into George's waiting arms. Harry soon followed. though he was more cautious, testing each step. Emma, the smallest, watched her brothers with determination in her eyes. The farmhouse transformed. Safety gates appeared at the stairs. The dangerous tools that had hung on the kitchen wall for decades now lived in a locked shed. George's bedroom moved downstairs to be closer to the nursery, his old room now filled with 3 small beds and colorful walls. James visited every other weekend, bringing toys and books from the city. Slowly, the tension between father and son eased as they found common ground in their love for the children. "I never thought I'd see you reading bedtime stories," James said one evening, watching his father rock Emma to sleep. "Neither did I," George admitted. "Funny how life surprises you." Winter turned to spring. The adoption hearing approached and George grew anxious. Despite all their preparation, he feared the judge would see only his age, not his commitment. The night before the hearing, George couldn't sleep. He walked through the quiet house, checking on each sleeping child. In the nursery, Emma was awake, standing in her crib. "Should be sleeping, little one," George whispered, lifting her up. Emma rested her head on his shoulder, her small hand patting his cheek in a gesture that always melted his heart. "Everything will work out," he told her, though the words were really for himself. The courtroom was crowded the next morning. George sat nervously at a table with Mrs. Bell and the lawyer the village had helped him hire. To his surprise, the back of the room filled with familiar faces: Betty, Dr. Harold, James, and dozens of villagers who had helped over the past months. Judge Roberts looked stern as she reviewed the file. "Mr. Wilson, you're seeking to adopt 3 unrelated infants at the age of 68. This is highly unusual." "Yes, Your Honor," George replied. "These children could be placed with younger families with 2 parents. Why should the court approve your petition?" George took a deep breath. "Because we belong together. I found them when they needed someone most, and they found me when I needed them." The judge studied him over her glasses. "That's not a legal argument, Mr. Wilson." "No, it's not," George agreed. "But it's the truth. I have a home, resources to provide for them, and more love to give than I thought possible at my age. And I'm not alone." He gestured to the people behind him. "My village, my son, we're all committed to these children. If anything happened to me, they wouldn't be abandoned again." Judge Roberts called several witnesses: Mrs. Bell, Dr. Harold, and James. Each spoke about George's dedication and the support system he had built. When everyone had spoken, the judge was quiet for a long moment. The courtroom waited. "Mr. Wilson," she finally said, "the purpose of our system is to serve the best interests of the children. In most cases, your age would be a significant concern." George's heart sank. "However," the judge continued, "it's clear that you have provided these children with stability, love, and community during a critical time in their development. Breaking those bonds now would cause harm." She signed the papers before her. "The court approves the adoption of Jack, Harry, and Emma Wilson." The courtroom erupted in cheers. George sat stunned until James clapped him on the shoulder. "Congratulations, Dad," he said. Or should I say, Dad again? That evening, as the sun set over his fields, George sat on the porch with his 3 sleeping children in a large playpen beside him. They were officially his now: Jack, Harry, and Emma Wilson, a family created not by blood, but by chance and choice. "We did it, Helen," he whispered to the evening sky. "Our family goes on." Part 5. 5 years passed like a whirlwind. George's quiet farmhouse became the liveliest place in the village. Laughter echoed through rooms that had once been silent. Tiny handprints marked walls that had been spotless. For decades, Jack, Harry, and Emma Wilson were now in their first year of school. They walked together each morning to the village school, holding hands as they crossed the fields along the path George had cleared for them. George, now 73, waited at the gate each afternoon for their return. Despite the many offers, from younger parents to drive them home, he treasured this daily ritual. "Some things are worth the walk," he would say. The farm itself had changed. George had sold half his fields to a young couple who wanted to start an organic vegetable business. He kept enough land to teach the children about growing things, but not so much that it became a burden. The money from the sale went into a trust for the children's future. James, who now visited monthly, helped manage it. "Dad, you need to think about yourself too," James often said. But George was thinking of himself. For the first time in years, he felt truly alive. Each day brought new joys. Emma learning to read, Jack building impressive towers with wooden blocks, Harry showing a natural talent for growing things in the small garden patch George had given him. On a warm afternoon in May, as the children played in the yard, Betty brought George a letter. It had no return address. "Came in today's post," she said quietly. George opened it with trembling hands. Inside was a simple note. "Are they happy?" He stared at the 3 words written in neat handwriting on plain paper. Could it be from the person who had left the babies under the oak tree 5 years ago? George didn't show the note to anyone except Betty. There was no way to reply, no name or address. But the question haunted him. That night, after tucking the children into bed, George sat on the porch looking at the stars. Was the writer of that note looking at the same sky, wondering about the children they had given up? The next day, George took the children to the old oak tree where he had found them. It had become a special place for their family. They picnicked there on birthdays and planted flowers around its base each spring. "Tell us again how you found us," Emma asked, as she always did when they visited the tree. George told the story they knew by heart, how Patch had barked, how the basket had been nestled among the roots, how surprised he had been to find 3 tiny babies looking up at him. "And you kept us," Jack said proudly. "We kept each other," George corrected gently. That evening, George wrote a letter. He didn't address it or put a name at the top. He simply wrote about the children, how Jack was brave and protective, how Harry noticed every small detail of the natural world, how Emma could already read books meant for older children. He wrote about their laughter, their occasional tears, their questions about the world. He ended with one simple sentence: "Yes, they are very happy." George placed the letter in a waterproof container and buried it beneath the oak tree, marking the spot with 3 small stones. He didn't know if anyone would ever find it, but it felt right to answer the question asked. 2 weeks later, George celebrated his 74th birthday. The children had made cards with wobbly letters and bright drawings. James came from the city with presents. The whole village gathered for a party in the garden. As George watched his family, both the one he had made and the one that had made him, he thought about the strange path his life had taken. How finding 3 abandoned babies had led to this moment of complete happiness. "Make a wish, Dad," the children shouted as he blew out the candles on his cake. George didn't need to wish for anything. Everything he wanted was already here, running circles around his garden, wearing cake frosting, on their faces calling him Dad.